what does it take to create a world that works for everyone? Because at a deep fundamental level, none of us are free until all of us are free. So if we're going to have a solution for our grandchildren in 2025, where they have a shot at a life that is productive, healthy, and has a life expectancy that we would hope for, then we need a solution to human affairs that doesn't exist today. And the Commons offers such an approach. Doesn't mean we're getting rid of the public sector, doesn't mean we're getting rid of the private sector, but it does mean a reordering of our priorities altogether based on everybody participating. And so if people have an interest in that in 2025, then it behooves each one to learn about and begin to participate in this opportunity we call the Commons. Hey man, go forth and prosper.
So how does the Commons offer opportunity when people feel like the government isn't handling it, that, you know, corporations aren't taking care of it if it's not their shareholders' bottom line?
Yeah.
So whose job is it? I mean, they feel like they're stuck because no one else is doing it. What does the Commons offer here?
Right. The Commons offers a way for people to take individual responsibility, create collective accountability for mutual benefit. And it's very important that to understand that Commons work best, as what we've learned so far, when there are real issues to real people. So we have real farmers in a particular area that need to organize around irrigation, or we have real software developers who are trying to organize with regard to the code they're going to share, or we have neighbors in a city that are really trying to grapple with how they're going to deal with shared parking spaces, for one thing, as an example. And so it's when people can get together on issues of mutual interest for mutual benefit that require individual responsibility and mechanisms of accountability that are held collectively, they can begin to build an effect, a commons. Now when we take a larger resource, whether it's a forest or, as you know, the Gulf of Mexico as an example with your work, that this becomes more involved. How does this resource have an intergenerational benefit to it? What are all of the issues that would need to be taken into account? And who are all the stakeholders that need to be brought into the room in order to make some binding, lasting agreements that could stand the test of time? And as we do that, as we learn more and more, and as there are legal cases that support this more and more, and we're seeing certain countries attempt to do this. Right now it's almost an anomaly, but we'll see that more and more. Why? Because we're running out of steam. People know we're running out of steam with the current model. Kevin, there are three important dimensions. I was just talking about this evening with colleagues of mine. There are three important dimensions around education with regard to the Commons. The first is educating people about. It's the about part of what is the Commons. If you walk down the street in Berlin or Chicago or in Cape Town or in Caracas and ask people about, do they know about the global Commons, you'll get a lot of blank stares. So there are a lot of people that there's a knowledge deficit as to what the framework of the Commons is, even if they've been involved in activities that they then redefine as, oh, geez, I've been doing Commons-related stuff for a long time. So the importance of educating people into the framework of the global Commons is very important. And it also provides a mechanism for them to express their concerns in a new way. So I'll just give you a simple example of this. I was teaching a course to executive MBAs this past spring. There was a hedge fund manager in the course who, during the presentation on the Commons, a light bulb went off in his head. The course was in Chicago, and at Notre Dame campus in Chicago. And he said, you know, I love the Wabash River. When I was a kid, I used to go and vacation on the Wabash River with my family, and we have a family cottage. And now I have, I take my kids there. And so he just has this love affair with this river. But he's really distressed because there's a chemical company upstream that's polluting the water, and the Department of Natural Resources isn't doing a lot about that. And so he's seeing his beloved river get sicker and sicker. When he was able to reframe and understand that this river is a commons, he could see now a whole new stream of potential action that he could take as a part of as an active citizen involving other citizens in protecting this commons. And so just the understanding of what the commons is provided a framework in this case for him to redefine his experience and take potential action in a new way that he felt empowered to do. So this part of understanding about what is the commons is an essential thing. And so we have something called the Commons Knowledge Alliance that we've created to offer courses on the commons to people around the world. So it's really important. So once people learn about the commons, the next step is how do you common? In other words, many people get excited and say, well, what can I do? Or how can I get involved? Or how can I get engaged? Or what does this actually mean? So then the whole notion of values and principles comes into play. How does operating in a commons framework, how do you really engage that? What do you do, but also how do you engage? How would you engage in a commons-based resource that would be different than you might engage otherwise? And how do you create, as you mentioned, value, and how do commons have value? This is a fundamentally important issue because, as James Quilligan and others have pointed out, from simply a market framework, what we tend to do is look at everything in terms of price, as an example. And so we lose the deeper meaning of the intangibles that accord value. Look at a tree, for example. Well, what's a tree worth? Well, if you're simply looking at it in terms of, well, what's its carbon offset value? That's one way of pricing a tree. Or how much lumber could it produce? That's another way of pricing a tree. Check this Chicago Board Option Exchange, you know, or the Mercantile Exchange, what the price of lumber is on a given day. But when we look at the intangibles that happen with regard to what we value in the commons, we have to bring in the whole set of cultural elements that really cause us to value life altogether. And those elements include the joy of looking at a tree, or the joy of going down a river, or what we might do to educate our children, or whatever it might be. So there needs to be a dialogue around all the elements of life, all the resources of life that we rely on and depend upon, and somehow we've kind of, in a consumer-oriented society, as you well know, we've lost that. We've lost kind of figuring that out. And so that's a really important piece of the puzzle. And that gets at sort of what I would say is the deepest part of the education that we're involved in, which is, it's not just this is what the commons is, and it's not just even what you do with respect to the commons, but it's, well, what are the implications of the commons at the deepest level? Well, the implications of the commons at the deepest level are, there's an intuition in every human heart about freedom. And in order for all of us to be totally free, there need to be structures in our human affairs that enable us to live our lives in such a way that we can cooperate with each other, that we can trust each other, that we can build things together. And the commons enables us to do that. And we know damn well that the market state no longer affords us, if it ever did, the opportunities for large numbers of people to actually have their basic needs met. So this notion of the commons is fundamental to, you could say, human freedom. It's fundamental to the health and sustainability of the planet. It's fundamental to the well-being of species altogether. And even more important to that, it's fundamental to participating in what we could say is the deepest, most ecstatic part of life, in which we can step out of time, so to speak, to participate in the deep joy and peace that accords with being fully alive. And that might seem idealistic, but I got to tell you, it really isn't. And we're living lives with a glass ceiling over our head today that has so kind of stunted the human possibility that, God damn it, if we don't find a way beyond that, the chances of this planet surviving with us being a part of it are small. And so the concern that you expressed earlier about a sense of urgency, yeah, it's there. Absolutely. And so the educational process is going to be key to this. And so that's what several of my colleagues and I have really dedicated time and resources and energy to and continue to in terms of commons education.
Do you have a good example of a commons working that people could learn from?
Well, I think Eleanor Ostrom and her colleagues have pointed out numbers of commons, of resource-based commons that tend to be on a small scale with irrigation projects, managing rivers, managing fisheries, where people have actually gotten together and developed a set of rules that would enable sustainability to happen. There are many examples, of course, in the digital commons where open software protocols have been successful, Creative Commons licensing has been successful, and these value of these things is propagated dramatically. So we know this works under certain sets of conditions with certain sets of principles, and we're understanding the mix of what you might say the art and the science of the commons, particularly at a local level. The new territory for us is when you get really above a regional level, when you start to get into a global level. We haven't cracked the code yet in terms of how do we protect the atmospheric commons, how do we protect the oceanic commons. And so we have to ask ourselves, just if you look at, were you at Copenhagen last year?
No.
Okay.
I'll be in Cancun.
You'll be in Cancun. Okay, so I was in Copenhagen, you're going to Cancun. There was no solution at Copenhagen, probably won't be a solution at Cancun. So we have to ask ourselves, well, why is that? Why can't nation states come up with a solution to what everybody agrees, all the nation state agents agree is a global issue? Why don't they come up with a solution? And we have to ask ourselves, can they come up with a solution? Is it possible within the framework of a nation state? And the answer clearly on these global issues is probably not. Probably not. That means we're looking at things through a lens of limited self-interest. And so if you represent Canada and I represent Japan, we're looking at the issue of climate change through the lens of, yeah, it's a global issue, but what are its implications for Japan and for Canada? How does it affect our respective economies? How it affects our various commitments and industries altogether? What would it take for every part of the whole to actually participate as the whole, to actually acknowledge that it is non-separate from the whole? And that's the very kind of consciousness that's needed in order to solve global issues, where we are able to take responsibility for the totality. And we can't sort of gin it up, you know, in some kind of artificial way, but it's actually entering into a profound process of beginning to understand, even presumptively at first, beginning to understand that there's just, when it comes to Homo sapiens, it's just one species, you know? There's not a separate species if you're Chinese or if you're Venezuelan. It's one species. And our species is just one form of primate. And so we need to kind of enter in more deeply to what we already know at a scientific level. Just during our conversation here in this interview, you and I are exchanging body parts. There are molecules that were in you when I walked into the room that are now in me, you know? I mean, it's pretty amazing altogether. So what's a you? What's a me? What's a nation? What's nation A versus nation B? So it's not just that this is kind of philosophically interesting to a certain intelligentsia elite. It's really more the fact that to actually operate with a set of assumptions that mirrors reality is what is necessary for solving issues. So one of the things we've got to come to terms with, or kind of grow beyond, is we've been operating on some old assumptions that just aren't true. It's sort of like when we thought, you know, the sun revolved around the earth. Well, it certainly seemed that way. You know, you get up in the morning, you see the sun over there, and it kind of goes up in the sky, and then it sets over there. You know, it seems to revolve around the earth, but just ain't so. And so this notion that we're different or that we're actually separate has been an assumption we've been operating with for millennia, but it just ain't so. So we got a new deal we've got to warm up to here.
Some of the hardest issues around the commons are around the issue of justice. People who've been thrown off the land, who've, you know, had things taken away from them that they always had access to. These are hard questions. And, you know, we've seen examples of, you know, seizing land in Zimbabwe that really, really seem to come off badly. You know, you start off with a high-minded principle, but it just ends in a morass of problems. But there doesn't seem to be a path forward for many of these issues about justice. What does the Commons offer as far as a new look at what's fair for all?
Yeah. Well, it offers a framework for, first of all, considering what is it that we need in order for us all to move forward with whatever moving forward is. In other words, the basic resources that we need for life. So whether we're looking at land, whether we're looking at access to water or electricity or healthcare or education, first of all, the Commons would hold that we're talking about providing not just for a few and not just for some, but for all. Right? The Commons, we're all commoners. No one's excluded from being a commoner. It's not part of a caste system of any sort. So when we take that as a fundamental principle that whatever the solution set is, and there might be a spectrum of solutions, the least solution has to be workable, and everybody has to be included in that. So in various sort of land challenges that we've seen, whether it was expropriation under colonial strategies, or in some cases attempts to reverse colonial land strategies, which have had various kinds of inequities tied to them, then things get really difficult. Things get very difficult if we don't take everybody into account. With a commons-based principle of taking everyone into account, we can begin the dialogue about what the issues are, what the needs are, and look at a set of solutions going forward. And some of these things are quite complicated and emotional, as you would know. And so it's not necessarily easy, but there can be a process of binding dialogue with parties that have mutual interest that can make our way through. The key is the original premise. This has got to work for everybody. And most negotiations around resources, which are viewed as scarce, even artificially, might be able to, would need to be addressed? You got a lot to do. You've been working hard, Kevin.
No, this is an important question. What would you ask of people who see this?
I think the important thing today is, 2010, 2011, is imagine a world that your grandchildren are going to be living in 2025. What is it you really want for your grandchildren in 2025? Maybe it's your children. And what are your concerns 2025? So that's not too long. It's only 15 years away. And if most people feel into that, first of all, we'll see that, and I've done this with adults and students both, that first of all, across cultures, people basically want the same thing for their grandchildren. Now, by 2025, we'll be pushing 8 billion people in the world. What does it take to create a world that works for everyone? Because at a deep fundamental level, none of us are free until all of us are free. So if we're going to have a solution for our grandchildren in 2025, where they have a shot at a life that is productive, healthy, and has a life expectancy that we would hope for, then we need a solution to human affairs that doesn't exist today. And the Commons offers such an approach. Doesn't mean we're getting rid of the public sector, doesn't mean we're getting rid of the private sector, but it does mean a reordering of our priorities altogether based on everybody participating. And so if people have an interest in that in 2025, then it behooves each one to learn about and begin to participate in this opportunity we call the Commons.